When it came time to the third part and the final section, I determined, there was an inkling in my mind, maybe I could stretch it out a little bit longer. I knew by the end of the third part, Maddie was going to come to faith. That was that was it. And the question remained kind of as I was stepping into the third section, is there a story for Maddie after she comes to faith? This has been a question that has been consistent throughout the CRU story. Is there a story beyond the end of the previous section? What I realized with the final section, I honestly, when I look at the final section, um, I know where I was at the time I wrote that, and I had become disenchanted with the story by that time, and so I think the last section is lacking some things. It's really unfortunate. But having read it again recently, like within the past 2 weeks or so, it held up a lot better than I was anticipating it to hold up. There's some cheats, and I know there's some cheats. I don't know whether anyone else will pick up on them. But I'll spoil it for everyone now. The reason that Maddie is no longer cursing is because I was afraid. Because there was so much negative feedback on the amount of cursing in the second section, that I determined that would be an example of how she was growing in God. And it's interesting, I had someone who was discipling me at the time, which that's a whole nother story. It ended in the worst possible way that you can imagine. And the scars are still there. But some of the questions that the ministry team leader, the head of campus, dude, asks her that are verbatim what this guy asked me. And this is going to sound extremely lame, but it's true. I did get some questions. Okay, so let me just spill out what the basic plot of the final section is, and then I'll go into a little bit of detail about the choices that were made. So, Maddie, this is 2 weeks after the previous section ended. Maddie has become enchanted with Jesus, and she's been reading her Bible, and she's just falling more and more in love with the idea of who Jesus is. But she doesn't know if she wants to give her whole life to him, but she knows that she really likes and loves the idea of Jesus. She meets up with the ministry team leader, and she says that she prays for River to come to faith every night. And he challenges her by saying, you have not come to faith yourself, so you need to stop thinking about River, and ask yourself which relationship is more important, River or God. And he says, think on it. And she says, I will. And it's this challenging thing. She doesn't want to hear this. She doesn't want to have to choose. But what he says is really, it carries a lot of weight, and that's probably there's a lot of I know I was kind of hating on the final part. There's a lot of really good stuff in the final part. Again, some challenging stuff. And then she's been trying to reach River. She hasn't heard anything from him. She's been texting him, calling him, hasn't heard anything. She finally sees him in the student center, and she steps up and she asks, why haven't you returned my text. And he says, my phone broke. And he receives a text message right then. And she's like, oh my goodness, you've turned into a liar. And he's like, so? And he goes off, and she says, River, I've decided that I want to become, well, I want to dedicate my life to God. And you are so important to me. I want you to be there when I do it. And he says, you can't be serious. He's like, no. The answer is no. I'm never going to do that. And she's like, but I know it's still. And she's like, no, no, no. I woke up from that fantasy of a religion. I'm happy with who I am now. It's all fine. And she says, okay, I'll pray for you. And he says, don't. I'll always be alone. And she says, but we can. And he says, don't. It's worthless. And she says, okay. She starts to walk away. He says, so now you're a Christian? And she says, no, but I will be. And the final scene is, well, before I get to the final scene, there was a description I added in the sequel of how River and Evergreen used to watch the sunset. And this was something that they bonded over. And she hadn't been able to watch the sunset ever since Evergreen passed away, and she always had the blinds closed. This was something that was never in the original script. It was just a throwaway thing I added in the sequel. And it comes back in the final part of the story in that she gives her life to God. And this really touching, moving scene. And right when she does it, she opens the blinds and she watches the sunrise. And she knows that this is the start of a new beginning for her. And that is the end of the CRU story. I'll be honest, I did not want to add a new character in to the final section. So the reason that Maddie's meeting up with the male leader is because I was lazy and I just didn't want to add a new character. That's the truth. But there's some weird like BS explanation about how, oh, she's like, we don't normally do this. Like, and she's like, girls meet with girls. And he's like, yeah. And she says, so why am I considered an exception? And he says, I don't know. I just felt called to talk to you. And it's like, this is complete. I can see the BS I'm doing in there. Hopefully no one else can, but I can totally see it, and it's painful. The fact that she's not cursing anymore is a little painful to me because there's not as much challenging material in the final section, which I guess it's okay. But the reason that I did it was because I was afraid, and that I apologize to the readers for. That's not okay for me to have done. I don't know what I was thinking with that. The final scene, it was, yeah, I do love the final scene. I think it's really beautifully done. This wonderful little sequence. Now, the release of the final section of the CRU story, it was kind of a whimper. Not too many people read it or cared to read it. I think enough people had become disenchanted with the idea by that time that they just didn't care to get to it. And I remember I got really polarizing reactions to the final section of the CRU story. I read it to Steve, and Steve was so disappointed. He thought I had cheated the audience and kind of he really hated the final scene. The final scene he absolutely despised because he talked about how it sounded like I was saying that her life never had any problems after that, and everything got better once she came to faith. And I understood. And when I look at that final scene, I see what he's saying. I do. I totally get it. The reason that I kind of did it that way was I was determining this was the end of the story. And I wanted there to be a finality to it. Um, Megan, again, love Megan, love her so much. Megan read it, and that's the scene that she remembers the most is that final scene. And she thought it was just captured beautifully. So I got very polarizing reactions to it. Did I ever consider going beyond the final part? There's a couple of reasons why I never did that. Number one is that the third section just didn't have a lot of traction. Not too many people were reading it. And so the audience was no longer there for the story. Another reason, and this is the more artistic reason for it, is that River's out of the story. If I were to continue with it, it would only be about Maddie. And I realized that the arc of the story was about Maddie's journey to faith, and that was heavily influenced by her friendship with River. And once that ends, I think that's the end of the story. So that's the artistic explanation for why that never happened. Um, yeah. Okay, so last couple of minutes on it, I went back and turned the original script into prose. That took forever, and that was so painful. But I added some new things to the original script. The opening scene is River and no, not River, Maddie and Evergreen watching the sunset, because that brings it full circle to the end when she watches the sunrise and she's able to do it again. Um, I also added an exchange of dialogue between Camilla and River in the original script, and it's more obvious in the first section that was now changed to prose that River really only wanted to be there because of Camilla. That became more obvious in that, and I think the end's dialogue changed a little bit. It was more playful, less cliche. So I did that. And then what ended up happening was I realized I have three sections. And I could just release them as three different sections, which is what I originally had done. Or I can combine all three. And that's essentially what happened was I combined all three. And that was the one that I try if I ever send people that way again. That's the version that I send them to, is the complete three-part experience. And you know what? All of a sudden, the third part seemed to match perfectly with the first part, and the second part matched beautifully with the first part. And the three parts all of a sudden seemed like they couldn't live without each other, that they needed each other, that they flowed so wonderfully through to that. And that's where I left it. Essentially, CRU, I tried multiple times to get CRU to try to do something with this because it was working. And the whole story worked, but it was for that special person that saw it all the way through. The whole story worked, and I thought it would be like this great discipleship tool or something that you might just, read for Bible study or something like that. Although, you should only read the Bible for Bible study. That's like, seriously, stop. But yeah, CRU just never latched onto the idea. They never wanted anything to do with it. And so, for my final thoughts on the CRU story in general, I will leave that to be finished in at another time.